So this is the lecture on musical development in children. You read chapter 9 in the textbook. And so today we're going to look at music development in children and things that we've learned through studying psychology of music. And when we look at music development, a lot of times we approach it from kind of a task-specific approach. We look at singing, or we look at movement, we look at play. It's kind of just this way that we attack looking at development, like how do we grow as musicians from early childhood on. And so we're going to talk a little bit about phases of musical development and children's representations of music. And then at the end, I'm going to talk just really briefly about how this debate of music and general intelligence, and if that, incorporating musical study in childhood will increase intelligence. So we're first going to start talking about singing and singing development. So as you read in the textbook, there's a lot of from very early on, children make a lot of different sounds as very young infants. And there's a lot of variable intonation and tonal sense. So even, very early on, by about 6 months old, infants are being encultured towards their own tonal system that they are exposed to within their environments. Infants, they do a lot of exploratory sounds. They do this babbling, and that changes into a chanting, and then kind of spontaneous singing. And in the text, it talks a lot about exactly what the different characteristics of spontaneous singing are. When children get to school age, around kindergarten, first grade, there are some things that are pretty apparent about their singing ability. First of all, children really have a pretty small range, and it's hard for them to vocally maneuver outside of this small range. So that's something to consider if you're working with children in early elementary school. But also there are large individual differences. Some children, they have, they can only sing about a fifth. But then other children, they can sing like 2 octaves. It's there's a lot of diversity as far as what students can do as far as producing or singing in their singing ability. Early in childhood too, text is much more important than the pitch or rhythm content of the songs. So you'll have kids that will try to get the words right more so than trying to get the tune or the rhythm right. They just the words are kind of a concrete thing that they can attach the meaning of the song onto. So text is kind of the most important thing in early childhood. We also should discuss that children in early childhood, children are much more able to match just pitches or small number of pitches and patterns than they are necessarily to matching or the ability to sing a song. Singing a song actually requires a lot of working memory. You have to remember the words, you have to remember the pitches and the rhythms, and then you have to be able to control the vocal mechanism all at the same time. And so, if you take the text away, that's actually more difficult for some small children because the text is that primary thing that they hold on to. But if you ask them just to sing, the syllables do do do, they're able to do that much easier. The research right now, we believe that accuracy just naturally improves with age. That there's this natural maturation process, and there's kind of an asterisk by that contention. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute about some research that I'm involved in. that is kind of looking at that question. So right now, pretty much, if you have a 5-year-old and they don't really match pitch, then it's not, there's, don't need to classify them as, okay, this kid is tone deaf. It really could just be a developmental thing, and then in a few years' time, they'll be able to match pitch just as well as anyone else of their age group. We should talk a little bit too about that there's this difference between matching pitch and using a singing voice. A researcher at Penn State University, her name is Joanne Rakowski, she developed the scale that it didn't measure accuracy. It didn't measure how accurate singers were to a specific pitch, but how much were they using their singing voice. And so what she found was that when you use the scale to kind of grade students, in first and second grade, they're really using this mixture of song voice and chant voice, which is kind of this monotone pitch for some students, not all students. But then as they get older, they're able to understand what their singing voice is. So that's something to consider too, especially if you teach elementary school, thinking about just the first step of having your students using a singing voice as opposed to a talking or shouting voice. When you look at trying at pitch accuracy, children are much more accurate if they are given a children's model to echo than an adult model. And the order of things are, if it's best to have a child model it, and if not a child, then a woman to model it, and then if not, then a woman, then a man. Some Kodai teachers and OR teachers, they definitely feel that men should always sing in their regular voice, not in their falsetto, because in the real world, they will have to practice doing octave displacement. There's different thoughts about that. We don't really have any hard evidence to show that using a falsetto in class helps in singing accuracy in students. I have a friend who's, if you've read Christopher Roberts' article on situational interest, he's actually doing a study right now looking at that. He's got 2 kindergarten classes, and in one kindergarten class, he's only using his regular voice, and another he's using his falsetto. And so he's going to, see if there are differences between their singing accuracy. It's pretty interesting. And as you all well know, after they go through, middle childhood and adolescence, there are qualitative changes in the voice, more drastically in the boys than in the girls. But girls also do have a voice change. Some of them are really profoundly surprised when I taught choir and I would talk about the female voice change, and I would say, well, you realize, if you think of an 8-year-old, their voices don't sound like a 40-year-old. So what happens to make that happen? Well, they grow and their vocal cords become larger, just like with the male students. And so for female students, it becomes the voice becomes airier, raspier during the transition, which for a lot of girls is really kind of traumatic. So that's a little bit about what goes on with singing. But let's go back to that question about do we just naturally get better at singing accuracy over time, or is there some sort of training? So until about 5 years ago, there was this idea that, just normal maturation, children get better at singing accuracy. And there's a couple of tacit assumptions with what we thought previously. The first is that we thought accuracy is fixed, that once you are accurate, you stay that way. And we can kind of see this in how we, label people as tone deaf or not. I have had students that have had a lot of trouble matching pitch, but after being a year in choir, they do get better. They're not great at it, but they're better. So definitely um, we have to challenge this assumption that accuracy, is fixed. And the second tacit assumption is that music training is something other than what we do in elementary schools. A lot of the research on this was really taken from schools in the United States or in Western Europe, where children were frequently given, classroom music activities. And so it could be that our classroom music activities is what helped these children help children get better at singing accuracy. So there's a couple of challenges when looking at singing accuracy research, and one, there's a lack of data tracking in the lifespan development of singing. So we kind of know what happens to kids grades K through 5, and then we kind of know what happens in adulthood. But we really don't have a lot of studies from grades 7 through 12. And so a couple of studies have been done in the past couple of years, some that I've been a part of, that really looked at this age group, and so that we can kind of get an idea of what happens over the lifespan. So there was a study that was done, and the purpose of the study was to compare the singing accuracy performance of children of different age groups, of different ages, and a group of adults. And so these data, they were collected at different times, but they used all the same methodology. And so here's some of the things. So there were 4 groups. There was a group of kindergartners, a group of 4th graders, a group of 6th graders, and a group of college students. And what these participants did is they all had to match pitches. Either like there would be a single pitch, or there would be an interval, or there would be a pattern. And they also had to sing a familiar song. I think most often it was Happy Birthday, which is a pretty difficult song to ask people on the street to sing. I mean, they know it, and that's the reason why it's used, but it's really a difficult song. So the thing that was interesting when we collected all this data, we found that kindergartners, they scored pretty low, their average. I take that back. They had about 60% accuracy. Okay, and then 4th graders, they had about 80% accuracy on most tasks, and then on 4th graders that was 80% accuracy, and 6th graders just a little bit higher. But then when you look at adults, it goes back to 60% where kindergartners are. And so if you look at the total pitches, and that's where on the 4 different types of tasks. If you look at the total percentage overall, sorry, I'm looking at a different graph, and it's kind of confusing me. So yeah, so we have this we see this progression up to 6th grade, but then when you go back to adulthood, it goes really, it's back at where the kindergartners are. So the researchers, what they are thinking now is what we thought was just normal maturation is not really normal maturation. It's the fact that children have these experiences in childhood and in their classrooms where they are practice singing. So there's this idea of use it or lose it, where if you no longer sing at all, then you lose that ability to match pitch, or you just become not nearly as accurate as you were beforehand. So some interesting stuff with singing development. So let's talk a little bit about movement development in children. And there's when we talk about the development, there's two trends that happen. There's the cephalocaudal trend, which is that they start moving from the head, and that kind of that they get more and more like their movement, like they have more control of their head movement and then their body movement, and it goes down to their toes. So like bobbing their head is an indication that like they're able to control it, but they may not be able to tap their toes. If you're thinking about small young children. And then the same thing goes for what we call the proximodistal trend, which that goes from the core of the body out to the extremities. So again, like if you're talking about a first grader, they may be able to sway to the music, but they may not be able to tap with their fingers to the music. So that's something that you should be aware of if you're teaching small children. Researcher in music education, his name was Rainbow. In 1981, he did a study looking at the ability to chant on tempo, or to clap on tempo, or to move on tempo, and they found that it was that order as far as their ability to do it. So chanting was easiest, then clapping was a little harder, and then moving was a little harder. But then doing combinations of those things was the hardest. And that's one thing that, again, we need to think about in our music classroom, that we, if we're asking them to sing a song and to walk on the beat and to clap, that's a lot. That's really difficult. So maybe by 5th or 6th grade they can do that. But I probably wouldn't ask 2nd graders to do that. And as it was mentioned in the book, children, if you ask them just to spontaneously tap a beat, they are going to do that faster than what we're used to, faster than what adults would do. So they have this faster spontaneous rate. The book also talks a little bit about musical play, and that's where, especially in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten, you essentially just leave instruments out and, let the children find them and explore their sounds. The book was pretty clear on that, this is about the process. It's about exploration more so than the product of creating, a musical product. And the book talks a little bit about the adult-child interactions. Just looking at the student and looking interested in what they were doing would cause them to interact more with the instrument. However, showing them how to do it would actually turn them off to the instrument, so that's something to remember. If you're interested in kind of the natural musical world of children, which, if you've been around, young children, they are just very, very naturally musical. My nephew, he's 5, and he just like makes up these random little songs, and when he's playing with action figures or things like that, he naturally just creates a soundtrack to things that are going on. So if you're interested in that, there's a book. It's called Songs in Their Head. It's by Pat Campbell. And it's really a study where she and some other researchers spent a lot of time in a playground, and they just looked at what kind of musical behaviors they were exhibiting. It's very interesting and very intriguing. So if you're an early childhood or an elementary school teacher, you should consider reading that. It's a good read. So as we were talking about, musical play is mostly about the process, but around 7 to 9 years old, somewhere in that, there's kind of this transition from being oriented toward the process oriented towards a product. And in the book, it talked about John Cradis's study looking at composing, where children that were younger spent more time just exploring sounds, or children that were older were more interested in practicing and making sure that it was going to be reproducible. There's another study by a researcher named Brophy, and it's a longitudinal study, so it was looking at the same students, looking at improvisation. And he found similar results where there is this transition from process to product occurring around age 8. And in the text too, it kind of it talks about the spiral model. They go into good detail on that. So the spiral model of of musical development, going from the sensory to the systematic. And that kind of ties in a lot of the stuff that I've said about development today in that model. I'm just going to touch on, for a second, constructivist approaches to child development. So it's good for us to kind of think about this development in a larger scope than just, how they develop musically. So if you remember from your educational psychology classes, Piaget, he kind of creates these stages of development where he has the sensory motor, he has the pre-concrete or formal operational. So like sensory motor, it's where the children really learn through sensing the world and being able to manipulate the world, whereas the pre-concrete or the pre-formal stage is, they're able to do basic, like they can infer things but not abstract things. And then formal operational is they're able to understand abstract elements and concepts. And so there's this natural progression that that children go through in order to understand the world around them. There's a really interesting video on YouTube. I use it in other classes where it shows probably a 5-year-old, things that it just shows how kid world is very different than adult world, where kids they don't understand the world in the same way. And so they'll, for instance, it's a researcher and a 5-year-old probably, and like the researcher puts out 5 coins in front of the 5-year-old and then 5 coins in front of her, but then she spaces the ones in front of her out a little bit more, and she says, does this one have more coins in it? Does this one have more coins in it, or do they have the same? And he picks the one where the coins are spread out more. His brain just says, oh, that's bigger, there's more. And, you can easily see that, oh, there's 5 and 5. So it just shows that kids, even though they can do a lot of things, they still can't, like their brain doesn't fully understand the world around them yet. So quickly talking about a couple other things, psychologists that have looked at development in children. Vygotsky, that looked at social development, where children learn a lot of their information from peers, not necessarily just from the teacher or from adults. And they go through, they learn things through this zone of proximal can't think of that word now. The ZPD, which essentially is talking about where a child goes from not being able to do a task without assistance to, it's kind of scaffolded so that they are able to do it by themselves. And there are a lot of, or there are intermediary steps where peers may help, or that they mimic other people until they are able to do it themselves. Bruner is another one, and Bruner is kind of is one of the fathers of constructivism, and he's where we get this word of scaffolding. And he also talks about enactive, iconic, and symbolic representation, which that kind of all deals with how we go from the very concrete to the abstract, and how we use symbols to help us understand um, how to represent things in our understanding. And then Gardner, you may have heard of Gardner's multiple intelligences, and so um, there are different. His belief that there are different intelligences, including um, musical, um, intrapersonal, interpersonal, kind of math, quantitative. There's a qualitative or more verbal language. There's spatial and artistic, and there's the kinesthetic, and now there are two new ones. One that's kind of ecological, or environmental, like understanding that your environment, and the last one is kind of spiritual, aesthetic. Yeah, so there's all these multiple intelligences. So we're now going to shift gears a little bit to talk about the article that you read about the script and Davison and script. And so what they were asking these children to do was they asked them, they taught them row, row, row your boat. And then they said, okay, now I want you to write down this song, so that a child that doesn't know this song can learn it. And what they found was they kind of got, these categories of different types of representation. The first thing that they got were just scribbles, and the scribbles were probably just reacting to the music. It didn't really necessarily there was no understanding, or there was no connection between the scribbles to what to the music. But then the next, and this is kind of like by age, this is what they would notice. The next type of picture they would get, or a type of drawing, would be what they called pictorial, which are they would draw pictures that somehow represented the text, or they would draw music notes that just really showed it didn't have any connection to the song itself, other than possibly evoke an image from the text. So several students drew pictures of a boat on the water with clouds, and so that doesn't show another person how to sing row, row, row your boat. It just shows them, oh, the song is about row, row, row your boat. So the next type of musical representation that children would create were these abstract patternings, and these were lines or dots used to represent the shape of the song. And so the example in the text that is just so wild to me are these little lines that get taller and smaller, and the small ones are the higher pitch. So once you know that that's the higher pitch, then you can kind of see that there is a logic to what they have written down. The next type is the rebus, which I don't know if you guys remember rebuses, but you probably did them in 2nd and 3rd grade, where you would write, it'd help you to just learn to read small words, and then big words you could skip over. So like a picture of an elephant, it would write out the, and then a picture of an elephant was at the zoo, something like that. Anyway, so it's this combination of words and pictures. And it's really interesting when you look at the examples, that it shows, even though there's not really any pitch content, it shows that there is kind of a metrical, a lot of times there's a metric element to what they do. So then there's also they would also sometimes provide, especially older children that are more adept at writing. They just write out the text, but then they shape the words in a way to reveal other characteristics of the song. So, for instance, the example in the text had row with a line by it, row with a line by it, row your boat. So it's got row, row, row your boat. So that is showing that line is showing the length of the note. So that example, like there's definitely text declamation that reinforces rhythm. They give phrase indications by where they put the words. Yeah. And then last, and kind of the highest order, is they do a combination of the two, where they give the words, but they also give some other sort of symbolic representation of either the rhythm or the melody. And so they give a couple examples of that as well, where the text is written out and there's some rhythmic ticking or something underneath. And so as the authors of this article, they say that there's kind of this general transition that goes, they don't go through different stages, but what they found was that younger children tend to do the more concrete things like the pictorial, or just trying to abstractly give some element to show the phrase, the direction of the phrase. And then as they get older, they incorporate more text into it, because in school they're using text more. But then they also combine that with other ways to try to indicate their musical understanding and to transmit that understanding to someone else. So it's important for you to have a little idea of what that study is about, because that is part of what you're going to do for your second data collection. And I'm going to talk about that in a separate video in just a minute. All right. Thanks for listening.